Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Historians of the two great wars of the 20th century used to talk also about the People's War. By this they meant the impact of the war on daily life for men and women. The men, of course, were conscripted into the armies and disappeared from their families for years at a time. The women left behind had to get on with things the best way that they could. Many went to work in munitions factories or drove buses, did the jobs of men working on farms until the menfolk came back at the end. But the civil society, the people, were largely mobilized behind the military effort and were an extension of the military effort. Wars were still won or lost essentially by the performance of military forces on the battlefield. But now in the 21st century, the whole aspect of the People's War is changing and in a radical way. Yes, of course, traditional warfare is still there, as tragically we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine with the Russians using tanks and multiple rocket launchers and cruise missiles and sending 60-kilometer columns of armored vehicles heading towards Kiev. But we're also seeing the war extending beyond traditional armies. First of all, the involvement of the private sector in sanctions. This is unprecedented. Normally, private companies tend to try to stay out of wars unless they're defense industries involved in war production. They don't like getting involved in politics. They don't like taking sides, and they certainly don't like the idea that war will be bad for their profits and the business bottom line. But what we're seeing now is an unprecedented and voluntary, not pushed by governments, mobilization of the private sector behind sanctions. Airbus and Boeing are denying spare parts to Russian civil aviation. Banks, for example, Citigroup this morning are cancelling their business dealings in Russia. Facebook and Google have taken the Russian RT and Sputnik news organizations off their platforms. We're seeing energy companies like Total and Shell and BP cancel massive joint ventures and investments with Russian oil producers like Rosneft. And we're seeing Apple ban the sale of its iPhones in Russia as well. We've seen also individuals, former politicians who have been on Russian boards like Francois Fillon of France resign, and the entire staff of Gerhard Schröder, the former German chancellor who's now on the Gazprom board, resign in protest as well. And this spontaneous reaction from business to hit the Russian economy is certainly giving a massive heft to the impact of the sanctions, the draconian sanctions that have been adopted against Russia so far. But we're also seeing the mobilization of cyber brigades to attack Russia and Russian critical infrastructure. Anonymous, a group that I used to complain about when it was attacking NATO in the old days, has turned its attention to Russia. It has claimed, for example, in the last couple of days, to have even disrupted Russian satellite communications, although the Russian government has denied this. The Ukrainians have called for the constitution of a cyber international brigade, which would go and again defend the Ukrainian information technology and command and control, but also try to disrupt the Russian command and control. Again, the transport system. A group in Belarus claims that it has now been able to stop the ticketing service of the Belarusian railway system, anything that can hit what effort. Now, of course, it's going to be difficult to know yet if taking down the Kremlin website, which was certainly a spectacular move, and other types of private citizen cyber attacks will seriously disrupt the Russian military machine. But it does help Western governments who don't want to get directly involved in a war in Ukraine. NATO and the United States have made that clear. It does help those governments to have these sort of cyber syndicates like Anonymous and others act in the defense of Ukraine. They could deny involvement while at the same time watching with great interest to see to what extent Anonymous, for instance, is able to reveal and exploit cyber weaknesses in Russian critical infrastructure. We're also seeing other groups, for example, Bellingcat, an NGO which has long used open source data mining to study the movements of the Russian army, give us valuable insights by tracing communications on social media of Russian soldiers into the morale, which doesn't seem to be very high at the moment, of the Russian soldiers who often been sent into Ukraine, being told lies about what they were up to and with very little preparation. The private company Maxar Technologies in the United States has also now given us almost military precision pictures by satellite of the movements of the Russian troops, again making it very difficult for Russia to hide its nefarious activities from our eyes in the way that it would have wished. Private citizens have come forward to donate cryptocurrency to the Kiev government. Over 33,000 have done so to date, and $34 million worth of cryptocurrency has been delivered. We also are tracking the movements of volunteers. 70 Japanese, as well as numerous Americans, Canadians, and Europeans, have volunteered to go and fight to defend Ukraine. Alongside the Ukrainians. This is reminiscent of the international brigades that went off to fight in the 1930s in the Spanish Civil War. The humanitarian mobilization has been very admirable as well in terms of churches and charities collecting food for the 1 million Ukrainian refugees that have already had to cross the frontier in order to find safety. So this popular mobilization of civil society, which is unprecedented, is certainly opening a second front in terms of the war in Ukraine. It certainly also is going to put Russian society even more on the defensive when it comes to Putin's attempts to generate support for the war. So if the civil society doesn't want to stay on the sidelines as passive observers, but to get involved, what should be the rules of the road? Well, first of all, is to get more information about the war into Russia, so that Russian citizens know what's going on and don't just get the lies of Russian state media. Not easy at a time when the Russians have just shut down a remaining free media like the Echo Moscow radio station the other day, and today are moving against Western social media companies, for example, by shutting down YouTube. So civil society needs to come up with imaginative technical ways of making sure that pictures of the terrible acts of the Russians in Ukraine are brought home to the Russian population, and that this is indeed Putin's war for which he has to take responsibility. Secondly, war crimes. The international prosecutor at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Karim Khan, has announced he's opening an investigation into Russia for war crimes. And therefore, what civil society can do to gather evidence, documentary, pictorial evidence of what has happened, is obviously going to allow Karim Khan to make a substantial case against Putin and his cronies after the war, to expose the corruption of Putin, his regime, and oligarchs. We know from the activities of Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident in prison, that exposing corruption of the elite has very much had a big impact on Russian civil society. Psychological operations against the Russian forces to exploit their poor morale and their lack of a sense of purpose of why they are killing their Ukrainian brothers and sisters, as well as helping governments in the West to protect our own cyber networks, our own information technology and critical infrastructure, should Russia decide to carry on its hybrid warfare activities and to attack the West by these means at the same time. And finally, to track the influence networks that Russia uses in the West to launder its money for example, on the London Stock Exchange, to hire legal firms and PR firms to try to brandish the image of Russian companies like Gazprom and others, the Russian influence in media ownership and so on, all the ways in which Russia tries to exploit the open Western society to push its influence and its narrative and to hide criminal activities. It's noteworthy that just yesterday the Biden administration announced a new klepto tracking task force, which will be in the Treasury Department, precisely to go after these shady dealings, for example, in cryptocurrency, of the Russian elite. So this is now a people's war in a way that historians of World War II would never have been able to identify with, probably let alone understand. Civil society is helping to fight aggression. This new mobilization also reflects the fact that I think people in the Ukraine conflict, realize that it's the values of freedom and democracy are at stake. And it's not only governments, but all of us who have to defend those values if we wish to live by them in the future. Thank you for watching and listening today. Look forward to seeing you again next week.